Hello everybody, I'm Sniping is Fun, and I want to welcome all of you back to my looking back on the Super Smash Bros. Roster selection series that I just recently started at the end of last week when I did an overview of the original Super Smash Bros. Game on Nintendo 64. Now in this part, I'm going to be overviewing the second game in the series, which was released on the Gamecube, Super Smash Bros. Melee. However you want to call it, it's Melee. We're going to be looking on the second game in the series, the one released on the Gamecube. Now, before I get on to talking about the newcomers and why they came into the game for the second one for Melee, I'm going to do just like I did on part 1, on the original one for the original Super Smash Bros., and talk about what systems was Nintendo looking at when they're trying to pull characters for this game. What systems were they looking at to pull characters from for this game? And just like the original, when I said 3 come to mind for that, 3 come to mind for this one just as much. And those systems being the Nintendo 64 again, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance. Now, unlike Super Smash Bros. On the Nintendo 64, which pulled from the Super Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy original, this one didn't pull anything from the GameCube at the time, because around the time when Smash Bros. Melee came out, it was the launch of the GameCube, so they really couldn't pull anything out because it was around the time the system came out. On the other hand, the reason why the Nintendo 64, the system of which Smash Bros. 64 came out on, was able to have stuff from that system represented in that game is because the original Super Smash Bros. Came out at the end of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, so it was able to pull from that. And so far, in the 3 games we so far have in the series, the original Super Smash Bros. Is the only game in the series that was able to pull anything from the current generation, the generation in which the game was released on. Melee and Brawl were not able to do that. Much, at least. Especially in Melee's case. Now, like I said, it was because and this all comes down to the fact that when Nintendo picks the characters for their games in the Smash Bros. Series, they always tend to look back on the previous generation. I stated this in part 1 when I was talking about the original Super Smash Bros., how Nintendo looked back on the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy original. And when it came to this one, they looked back on the Nintendo 64 and they looked back on the Game Boy Color. Now, the Game Boy Advance had some inclusion in this, just like the way Nintendo 64 had some inclusion in the original Smash Bros., just not as much at this case, because at this time, unlike when the Nintendo 64 came out, and it was about 3 years difference between Nintendo 64 coming out and the original Smash Bros., the Game Boy Advance was only out for about a year probably at this time, so they weren't able to pull a whole lot from it, but it was out long enough to the point where they can get at least some inclusion from the Game Boy Advance into Smash Bros. Melee. Now, most of the roster came from the Game Boy Color and the Nintendo 64, but the Game Boy Advance had some inclusion in it, and that's the reason why I include it, because it was a system they kind of got a character or 2 pulled from. Just saying that. But like I said, like I stated before, the systems that Nintendo was looking at to get characters for Super Smash Bros. Melee were the Nintendo 64, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance. Now, let's get on to the roster now. Now, before I get on to talking about all the newcomers that came in into Smash Bros. Melee, I'm going to go back and look at quickly the original 12 characters that were included in the original and pretty much why they were in Melee. Now, at this point in time, when we look back on these games, the original 12 characters have always been in the games. They were in Melee, and they went on to Brawl, and we could expect them in 4. Now, I'm not going to go and talk about those games yet, because I'm going to go into Brawl in the next part, and 4 after that. I'm going to stay in Melee. So at this time, Sakurai wanted to just keep all the characters around and expand the roster. But if you really think about it, since they were looking back on the 64 and the Game Boy Color and to some extent the Game Boy Advance, these characters had games on those as well, so they stayed around also technically from those games. The only one that technically didn't was Ness, but he's an original, so he stayed because of that. And that's kind of, I think, what Nintendo has been pulling lately, is staying with the characters. But when it comes to other characters, they still had the games at the time. Link still had Ocarina of Time. Mario still had Super Mario 64. Yoshi was in Yoshi's Story. Donkey Kong had Donkey Kong 64, which was at that time released. It wasn't released before the original Smash Brothers, but it was released after, so it was released before Melee. There were Pokemon Stadium games on the... There was Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, Puzzle League, Snap, the Hey You Pikachu. Those were all released on Nintendo 64. All of them were out by that time. What other characters? Kirby had Crystal Shards, which came out like a year after Smash Bros. Original. And then there was still Star Fox 64, F-Zero X, and stuff like that. The only two characters from the original 12 that did not get games on the Nintendo 64, or even the Game Boy Color, were Samus and Ness, because that was the generation in which Metroid skipped, and they were working on, for the Game Boy Advance, another mother game, which was eventually going to be Mother 3, and I have looked it up, and Lucas was supposed to replace Ness in this game, but they decided to keep Ness around because Lucas's game wasn't out yet. And he was later added in Brawl, but we're not at that point. I don't want to talk about Brawl yet. But yeah, Melee, the original characters stuck around because Sakurai wanted to keep them around, because all of them are important to Nintendo's history. They're all like mainstay characters that have been around since the NES. So of course he's like, I'm not going to get rid of any of them. I'm just going to keep them in the game. And also because of the fact for at least 10 of the 12, they had games on the Nintendo 64 Indoor Game Boy Color. And Mario and Luigi, you know, there was the Game Boy Color games. There was like one or two Mario Game Boy Color games, and you know, stuff like that. And there was even like a game, like early on in the Game Boy Advance, there was like a Super Mario game on there as well. You know, the original 12 characters stuck around because they were all mainstays pretty much to the series, and Sakurai didn't want to cut them, and they all still practically had games besides two of them on the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy Color. Now let's get on to the newcomers that came into Smash Brothers Melee. And I'm going to start off with the simplest one. I'm going to start off with Dr. Mario. Now when it comes to Dr. Mario, he's basically just an alternate version to Mario. But he's basically, in my view, been included because the Dr. Mario series at that point has been out for years. It's a pretty popular series to the Mario franchise. People actually do like the puzzle elements, and like Dr. Mario is like a puzzle game. It was out pretty much on the NES, Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Color, and everything like that, I'm sure. But the one where they really pulled this character from was Dr. Mario 64. There actually was a Dr. Mario 64 game released on Nintendo 64, and that was like the main game they drew him from. But like I said, it's basically a popular series in the Mario franchise, so they kind of wanted to include a second version of Mario to represent him, and they really couldn't, I think, at the time, represent like Dr. Mario as a costume for Mario, I don't think, because at that time there were no costumes yet in the series. So they're like, let's just make Dr. Mario a second character and we'll change his fireballs to pills and do stuff like that. Now, that's basically the whole reason by him. He was not, I wouldn't say he was one of the best inclusions in the game, but people do like him. But the reason why he was included, like I said, was because he's been around for a while, and he still is Mario, which, like I said, is like the mascot of Nintendo. They have yet to represent Dr. Mario at all, because they can't technically do that with his actual character. So they wanted to give it a separate model for Dr. Mario. And of course, there was Dr. Mario 64 on Nintendo 64, so they drew him from that game. The next character I'm going to talk about It's going to be Falco from the Star Fox series. Now, Falco is like a mainstay in the series. He's been in Star Fox since day one. And I think at this point, when it came to Melee, I think Nintendo wanted to certain rosters from the first game. They wanted to boost them up and add characters, but the reason why they didn't add a whole lot of characters in the original one was, like I said in the first part, the original Super Smash Bros. Was more of a test, so they wanted to just include the main characters practically with 1 or 2 side characters in the original, see how it went, and then they're like, you know what, if this gets popular, we're going to expand it and then make the roster bigger and add characters that maybe we could have or should have added in the original, characters that are like big time characters in the franchise, but since we wanted to stay with the main characters only, we did that. See, Falco could have been added in the original, I'm sure, but they didn't want to add too many like characters from each one. The only characters that got more and more representation were Super Mario and Pokemon, and those were like 2 biggest franchises at the time, really, outside of Zelda, but they didn't add anyone else besides Link. But like I said, Falco, they added him because he's like a mainstay in the series. He's Fox's sidekick, so he adds like that secondary character to the franchise that they can easily add. And of course, just like I said about Dr. Mario, and the fact that Dr. Mario was there because Dr. Mario 64, Star Fox 64 was still there, so they got Falco from him, from that game. So Falco was there because there was a 64 Star Fox game. Now, the next character I'm going to talk about is Peach. She's been a mainstay to the Mario series since day one, practically, since the original Super Mario Brothers on the NES, and she's been around since then. She was one of those characters that could have been included in the original, but they didn't because of, like I said, the limit on the roster, and she was added in because of that, and also because of games that recently came out at the time, like Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, the various Mario sports games like tennis and golf, and there was like Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance Mario games. So it was like the whole point is she was there because of that stuff at the time, like, and she was like a character that would have been included anyways, like at some point, because she's such a big character in the Mario universe. And when it comes to Bowser, which will be the next character I talk about, he's the same way as like Peach. He's a mainstay in the Mario series and practically has been there since day one. He was in Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64. He was in Mario Tennis, Mario Golf, any other Mario sports game or side game, like the Mario Party games, same thing as Peach. Like the Mario Party games, the side games for the Mario series, he was there. And also because at this point, even though he should have been included in the original technically, and since he was like a main person to be included in the Mario series for Smash Brothers, at some point he was included, but also because he's a Mario villain, and at that time they wanted to start including villains in the game, and like, you know, other side characters, because in the original game they practically just added all the good guys, all the main stars of the game, the good guys. This is the game that they started including the villains and lesser known characters. So Bowser was there basically because they needed to give a villain to the Mario series, and since he's basically at that point been the villain for at least 95% of the games, majority of the games, he was the one that they picked. He has that much history with Mario, and because of his recent inclusions on the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance too, he was a shoo-in to be in the game. He was a shoo-in character to be added in. Even before this game, he would have been added in, but like I said, he was a shoo-in for Melee.